Thank you, Dr. Bhatt, and thank you, Pranav, for all your kind words of welcome. I'm delighted to be here at NUJS. I'm quite surprised to find that students pursuing careers in law would be interested in nuclear diplomacy. But be that as it may, I'll try and give you a brief overview. I don't know how many of you, do you have actually courses pertaining to nuclear law, things like that?
We had an IR.
Or you have an IR capsule, and so how many of you know what, let's say, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is? Oh, quite a few. I'm very impressed. Okay. When we talk of nuclear diplomacy, I'll sort of try and, let me just give you a framework within which we can look at it, because it might help you in that sense. I would say that, first of all, the nuclear diplomacy is part of an overall foreign policy, right? And an overall foreign policy is part of an overall national security strategy. So if you start looking at, things coming down, you have an overarching national security strategy, which in the old days used to be called, sometimes if you find particularly in those of you who, if you read people like Kissinger and so on, they'll talk of grand strategy. And so instead of using that phrase, because I think phrases need to, in a sense, you have to look at it minus its values that are attributed to it. So instead of grand strategy, which would imply grand powers, imperial powers and so on, I think it is more value neutral to use a phrase like national security strategy. Within the national security strategy, and particularly in today's globalized world, you actually find that the definition of national security has grown. It is no longer just defense and military security. It is because the nature of threats has changed. It's a globalized world, so whether it is terrorism, whether it is food security, whether it's energy security, whether it is water security, people are talking of water stressed periods in future in this part of the world and so on. But we can't deal with all of it. So in that whole sort of thing of national security strategy, you would have all of these, and within this you would obviously have what you would call foreign policy, because it becomes a component in meeting your national security concerns. Because you can meet them in terms of your defense preparedness, in terms of your, obviously, intelligence is a part of it, to prepare yourself better. And in addition, you have foreign policy, which would enable you to deal with potential partners and potential adversaries at the same time. Within the foreign policy, you would have the nuclear policy, the nuclear diplomacy or nuclear policy would be an integral part of it. Okay, so we've set out a particular kind of a framework within which you have to see it. You can't, if you try and see it in isolation, then it doesn't make sense. Then you would say, well, this doesn't really. But if you try and see it in this totality, then it's easier to see where it is consistent with the larger picture and where there have been inconsistencies for whatever reasons, politics obviously, but people haven't been able to grab the total picture. So that's point one. Now, within nuclear diplomacy, India's nuclear diplomacy, I would divide it into three sort of broad periods. Say 47 to 74, 74 to 98, and 98 to now. 47, India became independent. And actually, if you look back, the Atomic Energy Act was adopted in 1948 itself. It's if you think back, 1948, when we had barely become independent, we did not as yet have a constitution. We had gone to war with Pakistan, right? 1 million people had been killed in the partition, in the carnage of the partition. 10 million people had migrated and were refugees and so on. Given this kind of an overall national environment, you would wonder why Pandit Nehru wanted an Atomic Energy Act. I mean, how the hell did it have priority in the government's thinking that within a year of independence, India was adopting the Atomic Energy Act? It is a bit strange when you look at it in that sense. And it only, you can only understand it. You may agree or disagree, that's a different matter, but you can only understand it if you remember the kind of person Nehru was, and you understand the kind of person Nehru was, and you understand the kind of person Bhabha was, Homi Bhabha, who was the architect of India's nuclear program, and the relationship that the two enjoyed. Now, the nuclear age was a very young age. I mean, the nuclear age, I would say the dawning of the nuclear age would be 1945 when the bomb was first exploded and then used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on 6th and 9th of August 1945. Two things happened. There were two dominant sort of thoughts that emerged right at the outset of the nuclear age. One was that this was a horrible weapon, highly destructive, the most destructive weapon that had ever been known to man. And the second aspect was that this was an enormously important scientific and technological development which would have boundless applications for peaceful purposes in areas ranging from agriculture, health, engineering, etc., etc., etc. And that this was a new technology. And this whole business of understanding how matter is created, how the universe works in that sense, and understanding the nuclear forces, the elementary particles and all the rest of it, was of great importance for benefit for peaceful application, and that this is a technology which should, in a sense, be made available to the developing world, which had to leapfrog into stages of development. So both these thoughts sort of dominated the coming in of the nuclear age. Nehru was influenced by both of these, as was Bhabha. Bhabha was a very, very reputed nuclear scientist, by the way. I mean, he had worked with the top nuclear scientists in UK and USA. They were known to him personally, etc., etc. He also enjoyed a close personal relationship with Nehru, ideologically, intellectually, etc., etc. So, in fact, it is because of the two of them, and because Nehru shared that, modernist view about A, the importance of science and technology, and B, Bhabha convinced him also that nuclear science and technology particularly, we should try and sort of develop this, because this was going to help us hugely in our developmental efforts. And that's why in 1948, even though there were all kinds of crises taking place around us, India passed the Atomic Energy Act. So the point I'm making is here, we were looking at stage one of India's diplomacy, say 47 to 74. So what happens during this period is that a lot of diplomatic effort is sort of driven by these two visions of Nehru and Bhabha. How does it manifest itself? It manifests itself in as I said, the Atomic Energy Act, that's domestic. The Bhabha Atomic Research Center gets set up and all the rest of it. And what happens is that we start engaging in international cooperation with other leading countries. And the other leading countries are essentially UK, US, France, largely Western countries. Germany, Japan, etc. had been completely destroyed in World War II, so I mean they had there was very little prospect of cooperation with them. And in this, you find it surprising that perhaps the very first nuclear research reactor in all of Asia came up in Trumpet. And there was no other country in Asia which actually had a nuclear research reactor. The first nuclear power plant in Asia came up in India, the Tarapur power plant, for which the agreement was done in 1963, and in 1969 it had started generating power. So this was all part of the focus on expanding international cooperation for peaceful application of nuclear energy and using nuclear science and technology for benefit of India. Internationally, it meant all these negotiations, the bilateral agreement to set up Tarapur, the agreement with Canada to set up the research reactor and all the rest of it, and so on. There was simultaneously the other part of the diplomatic effort was focused on disarmament, and the fact that nuclear weapons were terrible weapons, they were weapons of mass destruction, should be done away with, and that therefore it became important for the nuclear weapon states. And at that point in time, the most visible aspect of nuclear weapons was the mushroom cloud, because all the testing used to take place in the atmosphere. It used to take place way out in the Pacific Ocean on different atolls and so on. And that vivid image of that mushroom cloud with its radioactive fallout was something which always fired the imagination of all the disarmament activists the world over and led to these initiatives and calls. In fact, the United Nations was set up in 1945, and every year when the UNGA meets, normally in September of every year, and adopts resolutions, the resolution sort of starts off, the documents have a number, and the session number, like let's say if it is the 70th session of the UNGA, it would start off with UNGA/70/ a particular resolution number. And if you go back and you see GA/1/1, which would mean General Assembly, first session, first resolution, it deals with nuclear disarmament. So the point I'm trying to make is that at that time, the multilateral diplomatic effort, the global diplomatic effort in that sense, was focused greatly on trying to achieve nuclear disarmament. And in that sense, India, because of Nehru's and his conviction about it, also played a major role. I mean, Nehru was among the leading voices for calling for a cessation of nuclear tests. Then the hydrogen bomb was developed, and the hydrogen bomb was, many times more powerful. And the fallout of the hydrogen bomb explosion that was done in 1956 was horrific. And so then it led to yet another cycle of calls for an end to testing and so on. And eventually all of this led in 1963 to what was called the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which basically banned testing in the atmosphere. So in other words, the other way of looking at it is it drove testing underground. And I think this has been one of the problems with multilateral nuclear diplomatic efforts, in the sense that it's always a case of too little too late. But we can come to that. But the point I'm making is that, so this was a period, the phase one of Indian nuclear diplomacy, at one hand dealing with bilateral countries in order to expand scope for international cooperation. At another level, taking initiatives together with other like-minded countries to push for initiatives that could promote nuclear disarmament. And thirdly, in 1957, the International Atomic Energy Agency was created following the Atoms for Peace resolution. Once again, the Atoms for Peace resolution was motivated by the fact that this was an important technology and that properly safeguarded, it was something that should be used to benefit the developing world. And the basic charter of the IAEA was not as we understand it today, which is, as we normally understand it, it is the charter is nuclear watchdog kind of thing. But when it was set up, the basic charter of the IAEA was to promote international cooperation for peaceful purposes under appropriate safeguards. Gradually, the charter got changed around as perceptions of threats and concerns changed. Then if you come into the 60s, we had the other sort of main development, which was the coming into being of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And even here, actually, in 1964, India was among a group of 7-8 countries that took the lead in proposing a treaty for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. And India was among the co-sponsors of that resolution. And of course, as the negotiations progressed during 65, 66, 67, we found, much to our dismay, that the way the negotiations were moving forward, it was not the manner in which we had sort of visualized it. And so, when it came to 1968, when the treaty was finally concluded and opened for signature, we could not join the treaty and decided to stay away from it. We were continuously, incidentally, we were continuously involved in the negotiations of this treaty right through this period. And as I said, in 1964, we had taken a leading role in terms of proposing it. And yet, the outcome, the shape of the outcome was such that was not consistent with our own national security interests. And so, in a sense, we stepped away from it. And but the NPT, nonetheless, today continues, has been extended indefinitely and unconditionally in 1995. And all the countries of the world, except for India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, are party to it. So, in that sense, you would, if you were not an Indian audience, if you were, let's say, Iceland or something, you would say that this is one of the most successful pieces of international law, or one of the most successful international treaties, because of the widespread adherence that it enjoys, at least on that criteria. There could be other follies or other shortcomings that you could find with it, but at least on one criteria you cannot deny its legitimacy, shall I say. So therefore, because other than 4 countries, all the other countries of the world, since they all adhere to it, so obviously there is a certain degree of legitimacy in terms of international law that it enjoys. And that cannot be denied, whether we like it as Indians, whether we think, whatever we may think of the NPT. But, you want to ask something?
So if legitimacy is not a question, even the benefits are like very much established in those countries with regard to the NPT. Why does India have so many reservations against the NPT?
Why does India have? Well, I mean, as I told you, the way the NPT evolved was something which we could not. Now, here, you have to look back on what was happening in India at that time. But one of the key reasons, I mean, I don't want to convert this into just a discussion on the NPT, but one of the key reasons Anybody here who wants to take on this question and answer it? What is India's fundamental objection to the NPT? Yeah.
So India feels that the treaty was discriminatory to developing nations because it prevented any nations from developing nuclear weapons other than the 5 nations who already had. So those are the 5 major nuclear power countries, which would mean that they would always have the bigger hand, or would be the more powerful hand in the international strategic game.
Yeah. Well, okay. I think it's pretty accurate. The NPT was seen as a balance between 3 different objectives. One, the objective was non-proliferation, namely because by this time 5 countries had become nuclear weapon states. US was the first one in 1945, followed by USSR in 49, followed by UK in 52, followed by France in 1960, and followed by China in 1964. And therefore, there was a feeling. In fact, Kennedy, this whole proliferation business started during President Kennedy's time when he was president. And in fact, the rate at which it was happening, they said, well, in another 10 years there may be 25 countries with nuclear weapons. And it's there in his Kennedy's own sort of the documents pertaining to his presidency. And so there was an apprehension that, enough is enough. More and more countries getting nuclear weapons is not such a great idea. So one is, okay, we sort of draw the line here, so no more proliferation. So that was one objective. The second thing that was needed was, well, nuclear weapon states cannot continue indefinitely to maintain this kind of privilege, so they must also get rid of their nuclear weapons so that there are no nuclear weapons left in the world. That was the disarmament side of it. And the third was that, okay, countries that voluntarily say, okay, we will not get nuclear weapons, they should not be deprived of the scientific and technological applications of this, of nuclear science, and therefore that international cooperation, they should not be deprived of that, and subject to the fact that they provide the assurance that they are not trying to secretly use this to build a bomb in the basement. They should actually be permitted and encouraged to get all the benefits. So these were the 3 legs of the stool of the NPT. So there was the non-proliferation leg, there was the disarmament leg, and there was the international cooperation leg. And why did they decide on the 5? And how did they implement that? By putting in a simple language saying, those that have exploded a nuclear device by 1 January 1967 are nuclear weapon states, all others are non-nuclear weapon states. Because that was the factual reality at that point in time. Nuclear weapon states will undertake to pursue negotiations in good faith eventually to get rid of nuclear weapons in terms of general and complete disarmament. Non-nuclear weapon states will subject themselves to full scope safeguards, which means fairly intensive kind of inspection activity, reporting requirement, etc., with the IAEA, so that they can continue to benefit from international cooperation. Now look back on what was happening in India, because as I said, we're talking nuclear diplomacy, but above that was foreign policy, above that was something else, above that was something else, and then there was national security strategy, right? So what had happened in the 60s? You had 62 China war, and you had 64 China going nuclear. So obviously, India still was not ready to go down that path, and instinctively, intellectually, politically, we were still more committed to the disarmament side of it. Then Nehru died, and there's a huge political vacuum. Nehru was the tallest leader after 1947, and so he died after the China war. In any case, had weakened him politically quite a lot. Then you get Shastri as the Prime Minister, and you have another war with Pakistan in 1965, and then in 66, just after negotiating the Tashkent Agreement, the ceasefire peace agreement between India and Pakistan, which was negotiated in Tashkent under the auspices of the then USSR. In the morning, Shastri is found dead. So imagine the political uncertainty. That's a time when within the Congress they don't know who should become Prime Minister, and so they find Mrs. Gandhi as the political novice who should be easy to manipulate by the old guard. A little did they know what was in store for them, and so they sort of say that, all right, well, let's make Mrs. Gandhi the Prime Minister. These were also bad years in agricultural terms. I mean, you know, those years were known as ship-to-mouth diplomacy. It was that bad in terms of food scarcities of basic things like wheat and rice and so on, and we were hugely dependent on food aid from the West. It was also a time when Mrs. Gandhi obviously was trying to find her political feet, as it were. In 1966 was the devaluation of the rupee. Meanwhile, there were these negotiations that were going on, and something which was not widely known at that point in time, but subsequently is a matter of public record, that actually in 66-67, Mrs. Gandhi sent out special envoys to Washington, Moscow, London, Paris, saying that, look, we see the way this is going and we are very worried. Can you provide us with security, with a nuclear umbrella? In a sense, can you provide us with a security guarantee that were China to use nuclear bomb against us, you would protect us, etc., etc. And in each of these capitals, there was a negative answer, because we were not militarily allied to any of these countries. And so this was the kind of situation. So you were, in a sense, outmaneuvered and outgunned all around. So why, when you ask the question of why the NPT, so we did the only thing we could, which was step away from, at the end, and just say, there was a debate in Parliament actually that took place in 1969 where Mrs. Gandhi said that this treaty, we will come under pressure, but the government believes that it is not in India's national security interest and therefore we should not accede to this treaty. And the stand of the government was supported by Parliament, and eventually India took the decision not to sign. And then, of course, in 1974 we did what was called the PNE, and then incidentally the PNE became a dirty word only in 74 when India did it, because otherwise actually if you just look at the NPT text, it's very easy, you can download it on the net, you can find it just a page and a half. One of the articles of the NPT, which talks of peaceful cooperation, actually has a provision for sharing the data collected thanks to PNEs, etc., etc. So PNEs were seen, at that point in time in the 60s, they were actually seen as a very valid, peaceful use of nuclear explosive power, which would generate enormous amount of data to provide design information for building big dams and so on. Today big dams is a bad word, so that's a different matter. But the point I'm making is, so when we decided to call it a PNE, I don't think we were being entirely duplicitous, let me put it like this, because it had a certain legitimacy. The notion of a PNE had a certain legitimacy. However, the fact remains that the physics of a PNE is fairly similar to the physics of a nuclear bomb. But that's only as far as a bomb is concerned. But you know, to convert a nuclear device, which is what a PNE is, to a bomb requires a whole host of other things. And it requires a ruggedization, it requires a certain compactness, it requires a deliverability, it requires a shelf life, you know, all of that, because you're not going to start producing a bomb when you just need it. Whereas in the case of a PNE, I mean, you will put together a device as and when you need it. But I mean, that's a different. What I'm trying to explain is that so in '74 we did the PNE and then we stopped. So I would say that would be phase one of India's nuclear diplomacy. What changed after '74? The rhetoric, our rhetoric in terms of diplomacy about the NPT became sharper. You know, discriminatory treaty, targeted against India, etc., etc. Also, '74 led to the immediately the Canadians, the Americans, the French, etc., etc., all came together and set up what was called the London Club, which was an export control organization, because they said, well, you know, the Indians, they took this research reactor from us and we told them how this research reactor works, and now this is what they've used. They've taken the spent fuel out of it, reprocessed it, made it into plutonium, and exploded this device. And their scientists used to come to our laboratories and we used to share things openly with them, and you see the use they've made of it. So suddenly, you know, a wall came down, as it were. And Indian nuclear scientists from Bhabha Atomic Research Center didn't have the same kind of access. They, you know, supply of spares, equipment, engineering goods, etc., dried up. So that was the beginning of what was non-proliferation related export controls. That was the London Club, which later on is now known as the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the NSG. But the London Club was the first of the export control systems. And obviously we had a sharp rhetoric against these ad hoc export control regimes, which were targeting India's economic development and preventing India from harnessing the fruits of science and technology, etc., etc. So Indian nuclear diplomacy from '74 to '98, in a sense, was a very sharp rhetoric of the NPT and the existing nuclear order as it had emerged. Secondly, we said that we have a nuclear option. In '74, we always maintained it was a PNE. We never said it has given us the bomb. We always said this is a peaceful nuclear explosion, and therefore our security requirements, our security circumstances are such that we will keep our nuclear option open and under review. So the nuance shifted from what we were talking about earlier in the 50s and 60s about global nuclear disarmament. It became more nuanced in a sense that we have a nuclear option, we will maintain this nuclear option, and we continue to take initiatives for nuclear disarmament, but this time complete global nuclear disarmament. And the option would only become part of would only go on the negotiating table when it was in a global non-discriminatory framework. So you had Mrs. Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister, let's say, there was the emergency, and then there was a period when she got thrown out, and then she came back before she got assassinated in '84. So during that time, for example, there was this call for a freeze, a complete cessation of nuclear arms production, nuclear fissile material for weapons use, etc., etc. There was a call for prohibition on the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons, a non-use convention. That was one of the initiatives. In 1988, Rajiv Gandhi put forward what, in my view, was perhaps the most ambitious, most audacious, and perhaps the most unrealistic kind of initiative, which was called global plan for a nuclear weapon-free and a non-violent world order. I mean, non-violent world order sounds really unrealistic. I mean, as unrealistic as you can think it would be. But the point I'm making is that this was very much part of the second stage of India's nuclear diplomacy. Because on one hand, we knew that we had an option which we had to keep. And obviously the rest of the world didn't believe us. And so therefore the disarmament rhetoric had to be pitched at a really high idealistic level of non-violent world orders and all of that. So this continued, and then in the early 90s, I would say a couple of major changes occurred. The first major change was the end of the Cold War and the consequent breaking down of the Berlin Wall, unification of Germany, and then the breakup of the USSR. And suddenly it was a very different kind of a world. Now, Russia, as it emerged, A, was a much weaker Russia, and B, Russia was equally concerned about nuclear proliferation. Why? Because suddenly on their borders, they had three new countries, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. And all of them had nuclear weapons. In the old days, it was all USSR. So USSR Soviet nuclear weapons were deployed in various places. Not only that, a nuclear testing site was in Kazakhstan. A number of missile factories were in Ukraine. A number of assembly plants and advanced airfields for long-range bombers were in Belarus. So there was a certain amount of know-how, nuclear know-how, technology, capability, etc., that existed in all these three countries. And surely a weakened Russia didn't want these guys going nuclear. So, there was obviously a convergence of interests between, let's say, neither did the US or UK or France or any of these guys. So, but there was a convergence of interests, and these countries were denuclearized. They joined the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states. The IAEA went in, the Americans and the Russian scientists went in because the Russians knew exactly what was where. And told the Americans that, okay, this is how much we have, according, so just make sure that they don't keep away something and, give the rest to the IAEA. So it was all very neatly, nicely handled. And Kazakhstan, Belarus, Ukraine were all sort of struggling to find their feet in terms of their political systems, what kind of government, who would be president, etc. Their economies were, suddenly disrupted from ties with Mother Russia, so to say. And so in all this, with part carrot, part stick, that if you do this, then you will be eligible for much aid coming from Western institutions, World Bank, etc. So they were denuclearized, joined the NPT as non-nuclear weapon states and all the rest of it. And during this period, obviously, in a multilateral setting, proliferation of weapons was projected as the major threat. In fact, the UN Security Council, the very first summit meeting that it held at summit level, which means at Prime Minister President level, after 1945, by the way, was on 31st of January 1992. And it was one of the few periods when India was a non-permanent member of the Security Council, and Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister. And so you had, it took place under British Prime Minister John Major, who chaired the meeting. Bush Senior, not the young Bush of Iraq fame, but his father. He was the one who was, he was the US president, and he was there, and Narasimha Rao was there, and so on. At that summit meeting, you have a very clear thing of new threat, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction constitutes a major threat to regional and global peace and security. I mean, this is coming out at the UN Security Council summit level, which means that tackling this threat, whether under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter or more importantly under Chapter 7, which is legally binding, includes sanctions and all, becomes a responsibility of the UN Security Council. So curbing proliferation, making that into a key responsibility starts happening at that time. And, you see the shift from promoting peaceful cooperation of nuclear science and technology to something like this. And this is where the shift takes place. And let me just fast forward from here, and then you see what happens in 1995. I mean, we are now marginalized from this whole business. I mean, we can keep talking about global nuclear weapon free world and non-violent world order, but the world is not listening because they are focused on curbing proliferation, and we are just an irritant on the side, as it were. But on the other side, we've also got certain other things happening. I mean, the economy has started opening up, the market is too large to be ignored, the Cold War is over, the US wants to start its dialogue with us, and so there are other things that are happening. Narasimha Rao has his own policies that he takes on in terms of the Look East and all of that. So ultimately, the point, what I'm trying to show by this is that the nuclear diplomacy as part of diplomacy or foreign policy in general as part of and so on in the overall national security context. And then in 1995 we see so there is this momentum for what do you do with the NPT, because incidentally the NPT was supposed to have a shelf life of 25 years when it was first negotiated, which was very unusual. And why this 25-year life was prescribed was because people knew even at that time that it was a highly unbalanced treaty. It favored the 5 nuclear weapon states, and by 1995 it has also become very clear that this kind of a mirror imaging of the P5 or the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, and the P5 being the same as the N5, so to say, the nuclear 5, was not a good visual image. I mean, the message it sent was that you want to become a permanent member, become a nuclear weapon state. No, I mean, there is something. It's not that nobody intended it as such, but the way people sort of see it, and which is why even recently when Russia went into Ukraine and annexed Crimea and so on, a lot of people in Ukraine, I remember last year I was at a conference in Argentina, and a couple of guys from East Europe were all saying if Ukraine had not denuclearized, there is no way Russia would have been able to go in. So I mean, so this is all counterfactual, but nonetheless, it feeds on a certain narrative. Anyway, so you see that in 1995, all the P5 used their collective influence and managed to get through an indefinite extension of the NPT. So that issue was sorted out. There was no threat to the NPT henceforth. Because proliferation was seen as something which was more and more worrisome, so even the safeguards agreement of the IAEA were strengthened by negotiating what was called an additional protocol in 1997. By this time, the idea of underground tests, the US and USSR and Russia had done over 1,000 tests each. They had enormous amounts of data. So in order to show that they were very serious about disarmament, they said, well, we can negotiate a comprehensive test ban treaty. So you had the CTBT negotiations taking place, and eventually that treaty was completed in 1996. Once again, we found ourselves on the wrong side in the sense that when we wanted to, we had put forward certain amendments in terms of anchoring the test ban treaty in a strongly disarmament-oriented framework. We were also pretty upset about the definition of how a test was defined, because Article 1 says there shall be a test ban. A test is defined as what? And the test was defined as a zero yield test. I mean, zero yield meant that you could have a nuclear chain reaction provided you could keep the yield down to zero, zero being defined as the amount of energy that had been expended by conventional explosives in order to trigger off the chain reaction. Have I lost everybody? Yeah? All of you? Brilliant. Okay. But the point I was trying to make was that you had a situation where the notion of a test was defined, which helped those who had lots of data, who could therefore fine-tune their tests and do it in a laboratory. You know, so just as the Partial Test Ban Treaty drove testing from the atmosphere underground, I mean, we were apprehensive that this kind of a CTBT would drive testing from the underground tunnels into the labs. And that's about it. And so once again in 1996 we decided that we are not going to be part of this treaty. From then on, it was clear to me at least, having dealt with these issues by that time for nearly 10 years, and having prepared assessment papers of how the indefinite extension of the NPT, how the export control regimes, how the CTBT would actually impact on our option, it was absolutely clear to me that the test was just around the corner. It was just a question of time. And in fact, Narasimha Rao planned on tests in December of 1995. Very few people knew about it. But because 1996, I mean, we saw what was happening, and in 1996, the CTBT negotiations would have been concluded. So Narasimha Rao had the idea that perhaps we should undertake whatever tests are necessary in order to build up our datum, and then we can see. Because at that time, incidentally, even France was continuing with some of its tests out in Mururoa. I think Mururoa Atoll or something like that. But Indian preparations somehow or the other got picked up by US satellites, and the tests were called off. I mean, later on, Narasimha Rao, and I asked him, I said, sir, why did you do this? I mean, we were all set, we were just days away. And I was one of the people who was in the loop on that because I was handling the external sort of outreach. And he said, well, elections were also around the corner, and you know, in 96 we had elections. So he felt, I mean, I thought it was not a particularly convincing. He said, you know, maybe we would have been criticized that I had done it for election reasons. Maybe after the elections the new government can do it. So I told him, I said, sir, but by that time if the CTBT is already concluded, then we'll first have to take a decision on staying out of the treaty. Yeah, I know there's a point up. And how much can a joint secretary argue with the Prime Minister of India? So anyway, we had elections in 96, and you know, that led to a lull in a sense that in fact there was no government, and it was a pretty satisfying period in the sense that I was able to formulate policy and make it stick. Because 96, what happened was that you had the 13-day government of Vajpayee, which did not, and then Vajpayee quit because he knew he wouldn't have a majority in the House, and then you got Dave Gowda with Congress support from the outside and so on. By this time we had already declared policy, India will not join the CTBT, and we had moved out of the negotiations from, you know, and then of course we had the next round of elections, and then in 1998 India carried out its tests, and more significantly what you need to know is that India also declared itself a nuclear weapons state. and said we will henceforth be a responsible nuclear weapons state. So from option, you moved to nuclear weapon state. And so now your diplomacy shifted gear, and I would say that 98 or post 98 would be the third stage of India's nuclear diplomacy in terms of changing gears, and now demonstrating India as a responsible nuclear weapon state and claiming India's right at, let's say, the nuclear high table or whatever it is, as a responsible, as deserving of a responsible nuclear weapon state. So therefore, the idea of establishing a degree of transparency by articulating a nuclear doctrine, therefore the kind of engagement with the United States in terms of the nuclear deal, getting the waiver from the nuclear suppliers group in 2008 to permit, and because what does being a responsible nuclear weapon state mean? It means that you have a posture, a nuclear posture, which is seen as non-provocative or which should not be seen as destabilizing, right? Number one. Number two, you must show that you have reasonable export controls. You are not a proliferator. I mean, you are not the A.Q. Khan variety nuclear Walmart of the world kind of thing. Number three, it would mean that the world should accept you. So therefore, insofar as civilian cooperation is concerned, cooperation, nuclear cooperation for civilian applications, that you should be able to engage in. And so therefore, diplomacy sort of focused on ensuring, communicating and achieving these kind of goals and objectives, both bilaterally and multilaterally. I mean, we took initiatives, and instead of talking about global nuclear weapon-free world, we called for a global de-alerting of nuclear forces, because it would reduce the risks of a nuclear war. If your nuclear forces are on high alert and launch on warning practices and things like that, then chances of something going wrong or an accident or something like that are higher. But if you have de-alerted nuclear forces, maybe demated from delivery systems and warheads, things like that. So our initiatives also started taking a different kind of, they were less absolutist, shall I say, than what was the case. We, instead of being so critical of these export control regimes, we said, well, we are a responsible country. Our proliferation related export controls are as good or better than whatever the best global practices are. So therefore, there is no reason why we should not be a member, and so that's why we've been talking about becoming a member of Nuclear Suppliers Group, or MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, or the Wassenaar Arrangement, or the Australia Group that deals with the dual-use chemicals and biological agents and stuff like that. And this period of, the de-alerting was one. After 9/11, we took the initiative on terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. And, ours is still a resolution which is adopted by consensus every year. Though, of course, in a sense, in terms of its importance, it got overtaken because the UN Security Council then got into the act and adopted Resolution 1540, and because that is under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, so therefore it is legally binding and obliges every country to take certain steps. We've been active participants in the nuclear security summits that have taken place under Obama's initiative, and this is still a process that is undergoing. So, in a sense, this is the third phase of. So, if I step back and try and sort of wrap it up, I would say that you would notice that in each case, it can't be seen just in isolation, it has to be seen in a larger context. And you have to look at it also in terms of where India's domestic politics is, and what is the situation in which we find ourselves, which makes the government take certain decisions. And from there, we could say that there would be I would therefore, in this sense, divide it from the pure disarmament side and science peaceful application side of 47 to 74 to preserving the option and being critical of a discriminatory global nuclear order from 74 to 98, from 98 to now to projecting India as a responsible nuclear weapons state, but a state with still a difference, a state which is still willing to believe in a nuclear weapon-free world. Thank you.
See, to actually stating what is India's national interest. And it was actually one of the remarks of one of India's diplomats at that time, who said the entire regime was constructed in a certain way. It's like a drunk emperor telling the members of that empire, don't drink alcohol. And if that is the sort of, and it sort of puts a great burden on India at the same time, right? When you want to be a nuclear power, but at the same time are advocating for nuclear disarmament, how do you go forward with that continuum? And I think that's a question that every person in this hall will continue to have. And with that, we'd like to open the floor to questions. So please go ahead.
I have two questions. Thank you for that very interesting presentation. And given that we are trying to get a course on, we already have a postgraduate diploma course on nuclear law here, and hopefully have a subject also for our regular students. Your presence here and your talk hopefully would give us an impetus towards that. But I have a couple of questions. One on the whole issue of nuclear deal that we had with the US. In your trajectory that you drew, you marked 98 as a departure. Would you see 2005 or the subsequent developments around the nuclear deal as the fourth phase? And also, if after the end of 10 years from the first agreement between George Bush and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, how do you see the success or the failures of the deal, given that there hasn't been any nuclear reactor that is fructified by now, or even a contract being signed between any of the parties at this moment?
Well, that is why I would not call post 2008 a new, I think I would just put it as 1998, and I think the 2008 agreement or the exceptional waiver provided by the Nuclear Suppliers Group, I would say that that is very much part of the process. Incidentally, I mentioned the 31st January 1992 UN Security Council Summit, Narasimha Rao and George Bush and John Major and so on attending. On the margins of that meeting, I mean, just to give you an idea of India-US deal, I mean, what was it all about? It's not something that happened just like that. I mean, it had taken years of work. And again, it was determined by politics. So on the margins of that meeting, on 31st of January 1992, Narasimha Rao and George Bush Sr. had a meeting. And I didn't attend the meeting, I was sitting outside because the meeting room was too small. So I mean, there were just about 3 or 4 people inside, the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister and so on. And I was asked to be available in case there was anything that, there was a question or whatever. And they came out and it was decided at that meeting that henceforth we would start a dialogue on disarmament and non-proliferation issues. This was a subject which had been a highly divisive issue because India thought that all of these, London Club, MTCR, everything, all these nasty US initiatives were all targeted at us. So we lost no time in losing our shirt and criticizing the United States about all of these discriminatory approaches. And the US talked of proliferation threats and things like that. So basically Bush and Narasimha Rao said, look, I mean, the Cold War is over, the world has changed, we need to sort of figure out a way of talking to each other about issues that we have hitherto considered as divisive issues. So, that's how the talks began. So the first round of talks was in March or April of 1992, and that's so. I used to be part of it. I was dealing at that time with disarmament, international security affairs, etc., non-proliferation side of things in NEA, and this continued for twice, thrice a year. The Americans would come over, we would go over, whatever. And there were ups and downs, and then, during 1995, the Americans said, please don't come anywhere near the NPT review conference. And, we said, it doesn't matter, even if we are not there, the Indian ghost will always overshadow your whatever. But the guys were pretty clever in the sense they managed to get an indefinite extension through, despite the fact that there was so much of resistance to it. It was a beautiful example of exercise of power, real power, by the P5 collectively to overcome any single resistance, whether from the Arabs or from the Africans or from South Africa or the Brazil, Mexico, Argentina kind of thing. Anyway, then in 1996 we continued our dialogue. We were working together on the CTBT. However, once we decided that we are not going to sign the CTBT, then relations on this, this dialogue again went downwards. 97, Dabe Gowda, Gujral, the dialogue resumed again. This time the US wanted to see how we could, if we couldn't sign the CTBT, could we at least have a moratorium, self-declared, voluntary, things like that. And then came the 98 tests, and the situation nosedived. Suddenly we were under sanctions. Thereafter, the dialogue resumed. Within a month, the famous stroke Talbot Jaswant Singh talks, the 14 rounds of talks that we had between June of 1998 to March of 2000. One of the most intense sort of periods of engagement between US and India. March of 2000, Clinton visits India. And while by this time, most of the new sanctions that were imposed immediately after the tests on 13th of May 1998 by the United States, most of those additional sanctions have been taken off. Some of the older sanctions still remain in place. Then Vajpayee goes across later that year in September of 2000 or something, enormously important visit. And we decide to launch what is called the NSSP, the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership. It's a three-phased kind of a thing which is supposed to lead at the end of it to a normalization. We complete, by the end of 2004, we've completed the NSSP, but meanwhile there's been a change of government here in Delhi. In 2004, election, Vajpayee, the BJP NDA gets thrown out, UPA comes in, Manmohan Singh comes in. Meanwhile, of course, the US has also seen a change from Clinton to Bush. Now, we don't know what is going to happen, but funnily enough, Bush and Manmohan Singh hit it off together. It's like a professor and a student kind of a relationship, and it's great. And at the same time, J.N. Dixit gets along quite well with Condoleezza Rice, and then subsequently he died, and then N.K. Narayanan took over as NSA. He had a slightly more frosty relationship with Condoleezza Rice compared to J.N. Dixit, but it's still, so what I'm saying is that is when you see 2005, and then you see the 2005 joint statement in July of 2005, which says India will civilian nuclear cooperation and normal, as a responsible nuclear state. However, all this, then it still takes a lot of time and heavy diplomatic lifting, because under US law, under the US Atomic Energy Act, the US was not allowed to engage in even a negotiation, a talks with India pertaining to nuclear cooperation. So US needed a waiver from that law, its own law, which is where the Hyde Act came in. So the Hyde Act, India-specific Hyde Act, was passed by the US Congress to permit the US administration to open a dialogue with us. Then meanwhile, we on our side had to do our own separation of civilian and military, because obviously, since we were talking of cooperation in the civilian sector, so obviously your military side had to be sealed off from it, and because otherwise, A, you didn't want them snooping around on your military side, and B, their law did not permit you to make use of, I mean, if you had made use of things which they gave you for the civilian side and you sort of used it on the military side, then the cooperation agreement would be null and void. So we needed to do that separation, and believe me, our scientists were not happy about it. You know, there are a lot of internal battles that you have to fight in all of this kind of stuff. Because suddenly people saw their empires shrinking. I mean, you know, this way when it was all one big empire, it was different. So now the military side had to be, in a sense, hived off from the civilian side, and so it took a lot of internal negotiation as well for Manmohan Singh and his team of people with our own Department of Atomic Energy guys. Then after the separation, then came this thing that we had to now put our newly declared civilian facilities under IAEA safeguards to show they were exclusively peaceful. And we obviously had difficulties because we said, well, you know, we put them under safeguards, and suppose our bilateral negotiation doesn't work, how do we trust you? The Americans, namely. We don't do this, then, you know, we would have just unnecessarily gone through all this. So then the whole sequencing thing becomes crucial. And also when the Hyde Act had given the US the authority to open negotiations with us, Bush had actually wanted his Congress to give him a carte blanche, to say that, all right, you open negotiations and sign the agreement in this. What they did was, they said you open negotiations, sign an agreement subject to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and once you sign that agreement, you submit it back to us for ratification. We thought that was a huge betrayal of what Bush had promised Manmohan Singh. Because we said, well, next time, you know, you guys will put some more bloody caveats on it, and, you know, nothing that we want. So what I'm trying to say is, so eventually, then Bush made a public statement interpreting the caveats. I mean, he told us, well, let me see how I can help you guys, because here you had, remember the politics, the left, and all of that, and then they withdrew, and, you know, so you have to look at it in a slightly more complete picture. And then eventually we did that negotiation, then came the issue of the putting them negotiation with the IAEA, so we completed our safeguards thing. Once that safeguards thing was completed with the IAEA, we said now the NSG waivers. Then the NSG meeting was going to take place in August of 2008. The first meeting, the guys, the NSG works by consensus, so some smaller countries, say New Zealand, so what the hell, New Zealand would block it. And with some of these guys, New Zealand, Ireland, I mean, you know, some of these countries said, no, we don't like this special waiver for India. I think India should be asked to sign the CTPT at least to show its good faith, or, you know, to take on some obligation, which we had told the Americans, look, I mean, this is it. We can't do anything more. Then a week later, another meeting of the NSG plenary was called, and during this week there was some, you know, various guys had spoken to various political leaders all over the world, where then the NSG waiver was done. And then after that, we signed the 123 agreement with the United States, which had been negotiated pursuant to the Hyde Act waiver given to the US administration. And that agreement eventually got signed into law by the end of 2008. And then in 2010 we did nuclear liability law. Since you're doing the course on nuclear law, and I guess you guys know all the complications of liability law, and you will, I'm sure, design solutions to the difficulties of the liability law. So what I'm trying to say is that the India-US nuclear talks have had a beginning way before 2005. I mean, in a sense, you would see, when I give you the story, since I was involved with it from January 1992, I mean, and for a long period of time, and till the end of NSSP, I included that when I was Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington. So, in a sense, you can see that it was something whose time had come. But of course, it only happens when both the timing and the right person, they come together. I mean, but that's politics. But the tide was in that direction. That's the point. It's a rather long answer, but I hope it.
Protocol, which India signed in 2009
Yeah.
under the then government of Dr. Manmohan Singh. But later on, in his second government of the UPA2, we didn't ratify the same. And you said there was a lack of political will regarding that. So can you just elaborate as to what exactly was the hesitation or reluctance on part of the government to ratify the additional protocol?
We've done it subsequently. The Modi government did that right when it came into power. So obviously you can understand that it was not something. First of all, please understand the additional protocol was designed just as full scope safeguards, a term that the IAEA uses, applies to countries that are non-nuclear weapon states, right? Because by definition, a nuclear weapon state which is a party to the NPT, and there are 5 of those, US, UK, France, Russia and China, they are party to the NPT, but they are party to the NPT as nuclear weapon states, right? Therefore, they are not subjected to full scope safeguards. They can't be. They can't put all their nuclear activity under the IAEA's inspection regime, right? Only whatever they want voluntarily to put as a sign of good faith, which is also what we've done when we separated our civilian and military fuel cycles. We put our civilian fuel cycle under IAEA supervision. Similarly, in 1997, when the additional protocol was brought out by the IAEA, it was brought out with a view to strengthening non-proliferation related reporting by the non-nuclear weapon states. What do I mean? I mean, let's say, let me put it like this. Let's say I'm making a reactor, okay? A small research reactor. At what stage should I inform the IAEA? Under the full scope safeguards as it existed prior to 1997, when I introduce radioactivity into that installation, when I introduce radioactive material into that installation, is the time when I have to inform the IAEA so that they come, they take a look, they take photographs, they find out what is the quantity, they do material measurements, etc., install their cameras, put in their protocols, and so on. Now, under 1997 additional protocol, it meant these reporting requirements were made more onerous by saying, when you are planning this, when you begin construction, etc., so right from the beginning we need to have access to the site and so on. So these were the kind of exports, imports, all of that. So what happened was that additional reporting requirements were introduced with the additional protocol. Now, these obviously apply to non-nuclear weapon states. Now, nuclear weapon states, they said, well, we're not going to do this. But, you can't say that I will not sign the additional protocol. You are the NPT 5, and that would be very bad. So they said, well, we do what we would call an additional protocol light. And nobody calls it that, but it's my term for it. Which meant that they took some elements of the additional protocol, like advanced reporting if you are exporting some cesium sources or whatever, or things like that. And so you can say, if the additional protocol has 20 provisions, I take 5 out of those and I sign an additional protocol with the IAEA with those 5. And therefore I am a party to the additional protocol. Because nobody is publicly going to say, hello, you're only doing 5 out of 20 and I'm doing 20. So obviously, once we got acceptance as a nuclear weapon state, we also did 5. So therefore ratification was actually not a problem. Which is why the Modi government, to show its bona fides, was able to do it within a month or 2 of being sworn in.
Islands has brought a case against the 9 nuclear weapon countries in the ICJ, including India. So the allegations against India are that it's not kept up with its obligations under customary international law. So India's contested this on jurisdictional grounds. But sir, what is your opinion on the merits of the case, the strength of the claim?
Well, you can't see the Marshall Islands again in isolation. I mean, this is the whole humanitarian law approach. And the humanitarian law approach has been going on for quite some time. It started, with the earlier ICJ ruling.
1996.
Yeah. And then, after the failure of the, when people saw, particularly in 2010, you had the NPT review conference, there were 64 points of future action, nothing much happened. 2015 review conference was a disaster. In the run-up to the 2015 review conference, there were a number of preparatory committee meetings. When people realized they were not getting anywhere, then some of the smaller countries, Norway, Austria, Mexico, etc., got together and launched what was called the Humanitarian Initiative. And the Marshall Islands thing has to be seen as part of that. I don't think the Humanitarian Initiative, unless it is going to get, the big jolt could be, I don't think the US is going to change with the Humanitarian Initiative. The possible jolt could be that if a country like Australia, which enjoys a nuclear umbrella, or a country like Japan, which enjoys a nuclear umbrella, because of their treaty alliance with the United States, decides to walk out of that under domestic political pressure of the local population, say the Australian population forces the Australian government saying, you guys are hypocrites. You enjoy this nuclear umbrella and you generally support nuclear disarmament and you claim that and there is no real threat to Australia from anybody's nuclear bombs. So if you mean what you say, you tell the Americans that we don't want your nuclear umbrella. We can have a good political alliance or whatever it is, but the military alliance should be shorn of nuclear. Something that New Zealand did when they told the Americans that your policy of neither confirm nor deny, we don't approve of. The American policy is that their vessels, their ships, whether they carry nuclear weapons or not. And the New Zealand government, this was many years ago, they said that our laws are that we want to be a nuclear weapon free area. So don't bring ships that have nuclear weapons on our territory. And therefore, all they are asking you is, we're not going to come check, but please certify this ship not carrying nuclear weapons, that's all. So the Americans said, hang on, for security, national security reasons, our policy is neither confirm nor deny. However, we tell you, we will respect your laws, but we will neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons on our vessels. So the New Zealanders said, no thank you, that's not satisfactory. So thereafter, we've not had this. But but New Zealand is still a much, much smaller country, and I think Australia or Japan. But that's where the humanitarian engine probably, aroused the conscience, as it were. But I don't see that happening. So, and the Austrias and the Mexicos don't have that kind of clout. So either we will see the use of a nuclear weapon in some strange way, and in that I don't think, I don't believe that a terrorist will get hold of a nuclear bomb or something, because even to use a nuclear bomb requires a fairly high degree of sophistication ultimately. You have to bypass computer codes and permissive action links and all the rest of it. According to me, I think it is more serious would be, let's say, if Pakistani Air Force pilot is actually jihadi. Or, that is a more serious thing, because you don't really know what is going on in his head. Or a Pakistani scientist, and we've had, after all, don't forget, we have had evidence of, say, some scientists, some Pakistani scientists, who have approached and who had been in turn approached by the Al-Qaeda for access to weapons technology, missile scientists and so on. Some of the recent attacks that have taken place in Pakistan on their naval bases, air force bases and so on, it is quite clear could not have happened unless there was inside support. When the guys were able to get inside the perimeter, crossover from the perimeter, only because of support from inside. So there was some connivance from inside. And so this is where personal reliability programs, PRPs, become hugely important. But but that to me is a far more dangerous kind of a thing where there could be a use. And so there are two ways in which you would get traction into the nuclear weapon-free disarmament related initiatives. A use which would shock and jolt the world, or a major country saying no to nuclear umbrella because of domestic pressure. Because one such thing could trigger off another and another, and it could isolate nuclear weapon states. This is pure speculation.
So my second question was that a number of countries have been either branded or criticized for being realist in their approach to foreign policy and international relations with respect to nuclear weapons. So I would, from your personal experience in the field, how much does international law actually impact foreign policy decisions in this sphere?
International law does, but international law is part of it. Right? If you look at strictly international law, there is no international treaty that prohibits the use of nuclear weapons or the threat of use of nuclear weapons. So, in a sense, what has happened is there is no legal or there is no delegitimization of nuclear weapons. In contrast to, let's say, something like the Chemical Weapons Convention, where there is a Chemical Weapons Convention that has come into force, many countries are party to it, and the Chemical Weapons Convention says you will destroy all your chemical weapons, you will not produce any chemical weapons, you will not develop any chemical weapons, you will be subjected to inspections to make sure that all of this, your old facilities would all be sealed and neutralized and decontaminated and all of that, and so on. So what happens is that with something like this, even though, say, a country like Syria is not a party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, but because the norm, the delegitimization, because the nature of the Chemical Weapons Convention is such that it is a universally accepted treaty. It serves to delegitimize chemical weapons, and therefore Syria can be de-chemical weaponized even though it was not a party to the treaty. So what I'm trying to say is that vis-a-vis nuclear weapons, you basically have a moral norm that it has not been used since 1945. There is no legal, there is no legality against it. So the difference where you would have purely a moral norm to where you would actually get to a CWC or a BWC, which is a non-discriminatory WMD elimination, which created the norm, and then you had the BW in 72, I think, and then the chemical weapons in the 90s, Chemical Weapons Convention. So to move from a normative to a legally binding, delegitimizing role is a process, and I don't think we are anywhere near that, because the salience, as long as there are countries that talk of first use.
I'll just have one final question. So how do you address the bipolarity between India and Pakistan? I would make reference to the 1965 statement by Bhutto, where he said if India gets a bomb, we would rather go hungry and eat grass and get the bomb at the same time. So to what extent has nuclearization of the subcontinent affected our economies, and is it wishful thinking to actually wish for a nuclear-free world? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I do hope you get a nuclear-free world during your lifetime. I mean, maybe not during my lifetime, but I hope that you get it during your lifetime. It becomes a more realistic prospect for you than it has been for me. But India-Pakistan, you know, there is a general sort of convenient media-driven kind of a thing that, you know, India and Pakistan nuclear weapons in 1998, you know, and then look at Kargil. So how did it help India's security? You couldn't prevent Kargil. And then 2008, Mumbai, November. So you couldn't even prevent something like that. So, you know, just give up this nuclear weapon business. The fact is that at no point has any Indian doctrine or any Indian leader said that this was intended to prevent Kargil or intended to prevent, you know, a Mumbai-style terrorist attack or whatever it is. Because the Indian doctrine is predicated on a role that we attribute to nuclear weapons, and that role is what in jargon is called sole purpose. And the sole purpose is to deter the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons against India, no more and no less. We do not attribute a role greater than that to our nuclear arsenal. And this is why we have the policy of credible minimum deterrence and no first use and all the rest of it. And it has to work cogently and consistently along with your arsenal, with your targeting practices, with your command and control structures. The Western notion of that nuclear weapons have created a flashpoint. South Asia is a flashpoint business, and therefore the idea that, you know, it has not helped, and, you know, India and Pakistan are worse off and so on. I mean, one way to look at it is that you have, why is it that India-Pakistan nuclear equation is seen as unstable, but India-China is not? And after all, we have a boundary dispute with them, we have incursions and so on. And so why is that not seen as unstable? And after all, the Indian doctrine is identical. It doesn't say that it is different vis-a-vis Pakistan and different vis-a-vis China. The reason is very simple, because we are not, because Pakistan is seeking to find space below the nuclear threshold in order to change ground reality, to change status quo, whatever it is, whether Kargil or, use of non-state actors or whatever it is. With China, we are not seeking to do that. Neither side is seeking to do that. And so therefore, it is not seen as an unstable nuclear equation, whereas the India-Pakistan has conventionally been seen as that, and there is this whole industry of Western analysts who have continued to talk about it repeatedly and so on. But I don't think that we can allow ourselves to get drawn into that kind of a debate. Now, therefore, my answer is that if you see India-Pakistan as unstable, then please see if India-China is not unstable, and if Pakistan is, then surely Pakistan must be doing, first of all, you have an equation in which you've got two variables. And here is another equation with two variables. Now, this equation is seen as a stable equilibrium, and this one is seen as unstable. This one variable is common in both, so the other variable must be the one that's creating the problem. So why don't we see what is happening with the other variable, and then see where the instability, what is contributing to that instability. And it's an interesting question, but eventually I think it's the political nature of our neighbor and also the world around us. So there is a certain tendency. Also helps sort of equate India, Pakistan, keep that in a little box, and so on.
So thank you everyone for coming for this talk and spending your Saturday afternoon discussing India's nuclear diplomacy. Before